Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Science of Monster Hunter. I'm Dryptosaurus, and I'm a scientist, um, kind of in a variety of areas, mainly paleontology. Um, but this is, my video where I talk about the cool fictional animals of Monster Hunter and, what we can maybe learn a little bit about them. So today's episode is Steve Seregios, a newcomer to Monster Hunter Wilds, but was very awesome in Monster Hunter 4U. I actually never beat Seregios in Monster Hunter 4U. I fought him and then I gave up, and that's where I stopped playing many years ago. Um, but I might be back to show him what for come come the time that I have Wi-Fi, I guess. But yeah, so today we're going to be focused on Seregios and going over some of the adaptations and I guess just structures on this animal's body and what they can tell us about its behavior, as well as what the game says about it. As I always do, I've given Seregios a Latin/Greek binomial name. Now, it is a little bit of a taboo to mix Greek and Latin, so this is probably not something that would pass if I submitted it for a nomenclature, like officially, if I was naming an animal this, but it sounded cool, so I get to goof off a little bit with this series, so I got a little wild. But the name that I gave it is Laminopterus psittacopodus. That is, Laminopterus is Latin for blade wing. So um, the the fact that Seregios has blades all over its body and it is a flying animal. And then Psittacopodus is Greek for parrot-footed because the structure of Seregios' feet is shockingly similar to those of a parrot. I will get into that in a little bit and why that is, and also what that can tell us, surprisingly, about its behavior. For those of you unfamiliar with the way that species in general are named, this first part is called a genus. It is a small group of animals of different species. So, for example, lions, tigers, leopards are all in the genus Panthera. So they're all Panthera tigris, Panthera leo. And then the species, there's only one of those. There's only one species of animal in a species, and that's this part right here. We call that the specific epithet. Um, yeah, so that's how that works. Genus includes species, and when you refer to an animal, generally you say the genus as well, because multiple animals can have the same species name. For example, um, there's loads and loads of birds with the species name Caerulescens. So if you were a scientist, you were talking about this bird, Caerulescens, you couldn't say that. You would have to say Chen Caerulescens, which is some kind of swan. But yeah, about the cranial anatomy. Cranial is an anatomical term. It refers to anything related to the head. If you had horns on your head, they would be cranial horns. If you had markings on your face, they would be cranial markings. Um, Seregios has a pretty bonkers cranium. I mean, this is just an incredibly bizarre animal. It has nostrils that are super high up on its head. It also has binocular vision, so it's looking forward, and you can see here that I've illustrated its field of vision overlaps. Those eyes that are going forward, they're going to form an area of overlap that will let Seregios know how far away anything standing in that area of overlap is. Um, if I'm looking at a TV screen, I couldn't precisely tell you how far away the stuff in that screen is. But if I'm looking out at an open field and I need to mentally calculate how far away that stuff is, you can do it a lot easier because you're working with two data points. Both your eyes are working together in that area of binocular vision, and they're telling you how far away that stuff is. If you don't believe me, try to throw a ball with and without your eyes closed and see how much more accurate you are with your eyes open. Both of them. Anyway, obviously it's hard to throw a ball with both your eyes closed. I mean, like go like this. Um, anyway, uh, in general, just this kind of skull structure here, it's very low, fairly narrow, and very stretched out to the front. It looks particularly here like the stretch comes from the extension of primarily like the jugal bones back here, and then the mandible itself is also very extended, and that's not something you see a lot in nature, but it's kind of similar to turtles, but it's very narrow, and the jaw is very stretched out. And what that tells me is that this animal probably doesn't have a crazy strong bite force. We'll get into why that is in a little bit, but yeah. So the actual joint or articulation point of the jaw is all the way back here, and depending on the way that the muscles attach, that's putting a lot of distance between the front and back of the jaw. And the skull itself is relatively shallow. So if you look at what's called finite element analysis, where basically, in paleontology this happens a lot. They'll do computer simulations on the skulls of animals, or just their bones in general, to see how much force they can resist and where their weakest points are. And overwhelmingly, if you look at, big carnivorous animals, specifically big carnivorous reptiles, which Seregios seems to be, um, the ones that have very long and narrow skulls tend to have quite weak bite forces compared to their size. Or if you look at stuff like T-Rex, it has a very tall skull that, widens dramatically as it goes to the back, as opposed to this skull being kind of boxy. In fact, it looks like the front of Seregios' skull is actually wider than the back, because this is all neck muscle up here. So it's kind of doing the opposite, which is going to make its bite quite weak, compared like something like Spinosaurus or Giganotosaurus, which, they're not weak biters by any means, but they are very weak compared to animals that are specialized in punching through bone and hard tissue like Tyrannosaurus. They're mostly eating soft stuff. And that's quite similar to modern predatory birds, in that they generally don't do a lot of killing with their mouth. Seregios also, it seems to be the case that its mouth is not its primary method of acquiring prey, that it's not going to bite you first thing. Not saying that it doesn't bite at all. It obviously has a pretty nasty bite, for reasons that I'll get into. But the fact of the matter is, there are other appendages on its body that are a lot better for prey capture. So, another strange Seregios adaptation. If you look here, the mouth is actually toothless. These are all just projections off the inside of the beak. If you look at the beak in a cross section, it'll look like this. And the inside projections look a lot like teeth, and I'm sure they serve quite a similar function, but they just are part of the beak. They don't seem to be independent teeth. Um, and so, to summarize all that, it has a very elaborate rhamphotheca with multicuspid projections. Now, I will not leave you in the dark. That I will explain what all those words mean. So come with me while I walk you through all those vocabulary bits. So first up, what the hell is a rhamphotheca? A rhamphotheca is this part of the bird's beak. It's not just for birds. Dinosaurs that are not birds in many cases have a rhamphotheca. In general, I think there's some other groups of reptiles besides dinosaurs that are thought to have rhamphotheca. Oh, turtles. Yeah, turtles also have a rhamphotheca, but basically it is a keratin covering of the mouth, and the jaws, both on the top and the bottom usually, um, as opposed to teeth. When the rhamphotheca covers a section of the jaw, teeth aren't going to be able to grow through there because it's basically, a sock of hard material wrapping over. Keratin is much, much lighter than bone. It's also much softer, but it's also cheaper to produce in terms of the resources your body expends. So it grows back quicker, softer, and it's lighter than bone. Birds particularly develop a rhamphotheca because it is a lot lighter than having teeth. Teeth suck to fly with. That's part of the hypothesis as to why birds were so successful compared to the other groups of flying dinosaurs at the end of the Mesozoic. Before anyone gets heated at me and calls me a fake paleontologist for saying that there are flying dinosaurs. There are. I'm not talking about pterosaurs. I'm talking about stuff like the enantiornithines or some of the flying troodontids, which are quite similar to birds in a lot of respect. They're also very closely related to birds. However, generally they have teeth and birds don't. And those teeth gave birds a few very good edges over their contemporaries when it came to surviving the mass extinction. Namely, beaks are really, really good at processing seeds and insects. And those are two things that, when the asteroid-induced apocalypse hit, there are, going to have an easier time getting to that sort of stuff. Being a specialized fish eater in a post-asteroid impact world would suck. It would suck, terribly. But being an insect or a seed eater, you're doing pretty okay. And the other thing is that they're more efficient flyers. Birds have that rhamphotheca. It's less weight than having a mouthful of teeth like in an enantiornithine. And that's going to make it a lot easier for those birds to fly. And they're probably going to expend fewer calories a day doing that flying, which, it's a serious advantage to save on fuel in that way. I mean, if you were in the apocalypse, would you rather take, a Ford F-150 or I don't know, a Honda Civic. One of those is getting a lot better gas mileage than the other. But yeah, so this is a pretty reasonable adaptation for Seregios to have. A lot of the monsters in Monster Hunter, even the flying ones, have a Ramphatheca and teeth, which makes sense. It's a substitute for having multiple kinds of teeth in your mouth, and it also cuts down on some tooth real estate with lighter material that maybe those teeth are needed for, crushing bone, getting through hard material that they can't afford to sacrifice. And so the shearing part of the mouth is where the Ramphatheca is located. However, Seregios doesn't seem to be doing a lot of crushing at all, at least not with its mouth. What I'm talking about when I say projections off the Ramphatheca. A lot of modern Ramphatheca bearing animals, turtles and birds particularly, have quite smooth ones. You look at this albatross up here, you can see it's very, very smooth. They're just, two edges. Those edges are called tomia. They're like scissors. They, clip right into each other and they cut. They're shearing. However, sometimes certain species, like this freak down here, this is Pelagornis. It's an extinct seabird. It's more closely related to ducks than it is to albatrosses, actually. Um, and it has crazy projections coming off of its tomia, and those are probably for catching slippery fish. You need, something like teeth for that. But having a bill with those big, huge spines sticking out of it is a lot better than having teeth. So basically, they are getting the best of both worlds. The only thing they're kind of sacrificing is the durability of the Ramphatheca because keratin wears down quicker than teeth, but at the end of the day, replacing teeth also costs energy and teeth wear down as well. So it's all really just a trade-off. It's what's most energy efficient, and it's also kind of a post-tooth loss specialization. So it's not necessarily the case that Pelagornis wouldn't be successful with teeth. It's just the fact that it couldn't develop them because it already had a Ramphatheca, and for whatever reason, evolution went in the direction of making that Ramphatheca look quite similar to teeth as opposed to just losing the Ramphatheca and redeveloping teeth. But yeah, so they're much, much lighter and more efficient than teeth in the same way that the Ramphatheca is. Not necessarily objectively the better option, but it is one adaptation, and it's an adaptation that Seregios has. So, what do I mean when I say multicuspid? This is a real vocabulary heavy day. But trust me, if you're at all interested in science, knowing what words mean is very important. And I don't say that condescendingly. This will let you read and understand a lot more stuff. It is, really powerful to have access to these sorts of words and be able to understand what people are saying. A lot of the time in news articles and in conversation, people will intentionally or not, misinterpret scientific literature and either not understand or intentionally misrepresent what it's saying. And if you have access to that material and you can read it and you can understand what it's saying, then that's powerful. That's a good thing to be able to do. So I encourage everybody to learn as much as you can. Anyway, multicuspid. What does that mean? It means it has more than one point or projection. Typically, it refers to teeth. Our human teeth are multicuspid. If I have my claw here, I got a velociraptor claw kicking around somewhere. Where are you? Yeah, I do. You would call this, you would not call this multicuspid. This is one cusp. This is just one point. You look at this crocodile tooth down here. This is an extinct crocodile called, I forget what it's called. Lavoca I believe it's called. And it has two cusps on its teeth. Now, it's very uncommon for reptiles to have multicuspid teeth for reasons that I'll get into. And we just don't know a lot about the reasons why they evolved in reptiles specifically. But that's what the word multicuspid means. It means typically a tooth, or in this case, a Ramphatheca projection with multiple points or cusps on it. So, while we don't know in many cases why certain groups of reptiles evolved multicuspid teeth, we do absolutely know quite well how and why mammals did. Mammals are warm-blooded. We are, active creatures. I would beg to differ. I spend a lot of my day sitting in a chair. But generally speaking, we are active creatures as a group. And having very efficient nutrient processing is much, much more important if you're a warm-blooded active animal as opposed to a cold-blooded sedentary animal. Because, if you're taking in a lot of nutrients And you're also losing a lot of nutrients with those muscle movements and everything else that you're doing. You want to make sure your chewing and your digestion, all that is as nutrient efficient as possible. And to do that, one thing that's really important is to have teeth that are optimally designed for nutrient processing and getting through all that material. Think about it like a computer. If you ever build a computer, you know that it's more expensive and you're going to need a bigger power supply if you are, using a graphics card, a GPU. But the advantage of having a GPU over not having one is despite consuming all that power, you get to play those cool games, or in the case of mammals, you get to outcompete ectotherms in certain niches. But those teeth are necessary for taking in those nutrients efficiently. And mammals also have a very complex method of chewing. They don't just go up and down like a lot of reptiles do. They move their jaws around. They can do a lot of different things with them. And a lot of groups of reptiles just can't do that. So having complex multicuspid chewing teeth is going to make food processing more efficient. And what that tells us is that Seregios is probably warm-blooded and needs that trait evolutionarily to process food efficiently, as opposed to doing the reptile thing of kind of just taking a couple bites and swallowing it whole. So what do all these cranial traits mean for Seregios? What can we extrapolate from all that? Well, it needs an efficient method of intake, probably because it's burning a ton of calories because it's warm-blooded. It does not have true teeth, probably because it's a flying active predator that needs to move as fast as possible while reducing its energy intake. Like many birds, it's probably not using its mouth to directly kill prey. That's what the claws are for. Um, and it also has a very highly mobile tongue, so it can probably chew in a relatively complex way, pushing food around the mouth with that tongue that can flip up and down and go side to side. And maybe it's moving its mouth side to side as well. To figure that out, I would have to get a chunk of Seregios beak and then to do microwear analysis on it, which is basically when you look at it real close and see what directions the grooves from the other parts of the beak rubbing against it are. Cool science. I'd like to do that eventually. I've never actually gotten the opportunity to work on it. Um, but it's probably quite efficient at digesting meat, and it's probably chewing its food. On the other side, the soft material that its beak is made out of, and as well as just the weak construction of the jaws, mean that it's probably not eating bones. At least it's not chewing on them. It could do the bearded vulture thing of picking up bones, dropping them, and swallowing them whole that way, but I don't really see Seregios doing that. It just seems inefficient with the size of the bones that it would need to do that to. So I imagine that it's probably perfectly fine just eating the soft parts of a carcass and, getting the entrails and all that. So now let's talk about all that. Seregios has this gigantic spine on its head. Uh, Initially, I thought it was a horn, for obvious reasons, because that's usually the kind of structure you see there, but the way that it moves around, it's muscular like the other scales. It flips up and down. So it's probably just a really, really big central scale that operates similarly to the other ones. It also has tons of other lumps and bumps on its face, and those could be there for a variety of reasons. If they're different individual to individual, they could be for recognition, but they're probably for protection and or intimidation. So why would it be developing these features in the first place? The horn is not very much a main weapon. It's not, using that to attack the hunter or prey, as far as I can tell. So why would it be so big and exaggerated? In social species, like a lot of ungulates, so hoofed animals, think about like cows or reindeer or, those guys. Big horns or big antlers can indicate fitness and be for sexual display. They can wave them around, that sort of thing. They can display those big structures against rivals to scare them off without risking violence. In solitary species, it can also be involved in that. You can have this big like banner that says to anyone else who could be in your territory, watch out, this territory is controlled by a very strong, powerful individual who's very successful. You might want to go the other way. It's a very good signal. If you are an isolated species that comes together to breed, it might be worth it if other similar species are sharing that breeding ground to have a structure like that that differentiates you from the other species. And it could also be for protection from predators. But there's not really a universal reason for the development of this sort of structure. Um, there are just so many potential uses for something like that that it's impossible to really nail something down for Seregios specifically, or really any species without analyzing their behavior. Let's get on to the cervical anatomy of Seregios. Cervical is a term that means relating to the neck. You'll often hear it used in conjunction with a certain kind of bone. So cervical vertebrae, which are the backbones that go through your neck. Cervical osteoderms, osteoderms that would go on the neck. If it's the back of the neck specifically, oftentimes you'll hear the word nuchal, but we're not going to use that here because Seregios' osteoderms go all the way around the neck. They're wrapped around it like a sleeve. And like I said, they're covered in osteoderms. These osteoderms are highly mobile, and they act as both defensive and offensive weaponry, depending on the position that they're in, which is pretty cool. What is an osteoderm anyway? Osteoderm literally means bone skin. They're little chunks of bone that are embedded within a piece of skin or scale or tissue, and they're fantastic for paleontology because they are great at fossilizing. And so we can get a lot of information about animals with osteoderms, more so than we can from animals without. If you've ever seen that very famous fossilized ankylosaurid, Borealopelta, it's at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada. It looks like it died yesterday, and that's because it died, drifted out to the ocean somehow, flipped onto its back, and those osteoderms protected it from scavengers, so the top is completely done. But it was buried back down in a seabed, and it was completely untouched on the backside because it was armored so well. Those osteoderms do not break down very easily. And so Seregios has a ton of these structures in its body. Osteoderms are also super bizarre because they appear so many different ways and so many different times in the fossil record. It does not take a lot of mutation or adaptation to develop osteoderms, and so they appear convergently many times. So think about something like pectoral fins. The fins on the side of a dolphin and a shark are really quite different in terms of their structure, besides the fact that they're both attached to the shoulder. But the dolphin convergently evolved the same structure as the shark, despite the fact that probably very little of the same genetic information is in both of them. So, because of that, osteoderms can have many, many purposes, and they can appear in many places in nature. And I'm going to go over a few of them. This guy's in the news right now, Spicamellis. This art is by Dino Dan or Connor Ashbridge. This is a crazy animal. It's closely related to Ankylosaurus, but it just has just absurd dermal armor. These are all osteoderms. They're chunks of bone that are sticking out of the skin and sometimes attached to the ribs directly in various ways. It also has these gigantic ones here, and then it has rows of thagomizers on the tail like Stegosaurus. Stegosaurus itself also has very similar structures on its body. In fact, it's quite closely related to the Ankylosaurs, and they probably developed their osteoderms from the same common ancestor, so that's not a convergent evolution. The Thyreophorans is the name of the group of dinosaurs that has all these crazy dermal structures. That means shield bearer, and it's a great name because that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, their bodies are living tanks, and so this is one example of defensive osteoderms. And I guess you could call that offensive, the tail spikes there. Those would be probably an offensive weapon. So this little guy is Parapropaleohoplophoros septentrionalis. It is an extinct relative of armadillos. Um, that name is ridiculous. But it also has a bunch of little osteoderms. Mammals, a lot of the time, also surprisingly have structures like this. They are usually armor rather than being adapted into offensive weapons like you saw with Spicamellis. But they offer pretty great protection against the things that this guy had to worry about, which are probably like saber cats and stuff. Osteoderms also appear in a lot of living animals, mammals specifically, xenarthrans, so like armadillos, sloths, anteaters. I think that's all the xenarthrans, really. But they have osteoderms. And it's kind of crazy because they're covered by fur in most cases, so you can't really tell that they're there. Um, but they are. If you look inside of an anteater, it's going to have little bits of bone inside its skin. And a lot of extinct giant ground sloths as well had osteoderms, offering protection from saber cats and short-faced bears and humans. This little guy is Semasuchus. He is an armored crocodile. This screenshot is from Prehistoric Planet. This guy lived in the Cretaceous of Madagascar, so right at the tail end of when the dinosaurs were running around. This is a herbivorous relative of crocodiles. You can see it looks pretty similar to crocodiles, and it even has very crocodile-esque armor plating on its back. The armor of Semasuchus is actually a little bit more extensive than most modern crocodiles because it's kind of fused into these big plates almost, which is really, really cool. Um, but yeah, you can see this is quite similar to living animals, but it's got its own little twist going on. And these are two osteoderm-bearing fellas from the Triassic. Surprisingly, neither of them are dinosaurs, which is something I always love to tell people when I look at this beautiful piece of paleoart by Julius Chutney, I think is how you say his name. I think it's Chutney. But this guy right here is Postosuchus. At one time, it was thought to be an ancestor of Tyrannosaurus rex when it was first discovered, because its skull looks so similar. But it's actually more closely related to modern crocodiles, and so is this guy, Desmatosaurus. This is a scene, I assume, from the Triassic of Texas, because that's where Postosuchus is from. Then again, it doesn't really matter, because in the Triassic, everything was Pangea, so everybody was kind of everywhere. But Postosuchus has a few osteoderms. They run down its back, very similar to modern crocodiles, whereas Desmatosaurus has these gigantic specialized ones that are around its neck, probably because the neck is a good place to have armor, as it is the #1 place that predators are going to go for. And it also has those big plates of osteoderms along its back, so it's a very well-armored animal, quite similar to the ankylosaurs that we looked at earlier. But it also has a little bit of that offensive weaponry. It's actually quite similar to the nodosaurs. A lot of them have big neck protrusions. A familiar example, the saltwater crocodile, Crocodylus porosus. Osteoderms are very much not just a paleontology thing. There are a lot of living animals, like I said, that have them, which is crazy, because usually stuff that's that cool only appears in extinct animals. Some adaptations from the past are just so wild, and this feels like it would be one of them, having bone armor on the outside of your body. But living crocodiles all have them. And most of their relatives do as well. So one thing you'll notice about osteoderms and those examples that I showed you is that they're primarily defensive. There's some examples of them being used as weapons, but they're never really used as weapons for prey capture, which is the main thing that predators have to be worried about. However, with Seregios, it is an active predator and it has osteoderms almost all over its body. So why do predators develop osteoderms? They do in real life as well. Obviously, crocodiles are predatory, so is Postosuchus. And the cost sometimes is outweighed by the benefits. And in this case, the cost of hampering the flight significantly seems to need a really, really strong benefit. And I think the biggest benefit that it could have here is protecting Seregios from other Seregios. We know from the lore of the game that Seregios are extremely territorial. They frequently drive each other out of certain territories. And for Seregios, partially probably because of all those osteoderms, getting driven out of your territory is a really bad situation. If you have to move long distances with that sort of armor on your body, it would suck. It'd be really terrible. And so having strong, powerful armor is kind of one way out of that arms race. If you have the strongest armor, you never have to fly long distances, and you can be, chilling. You can be a very safe and risk-free individual. However, hypothetically, if there was a subspecies of Seregios that didn't really have to worry about competition and could just fly those long distances with ease, then maybe it could get away with not having those spines. So that's something that I'd like to see explored. I would imagine that these osteoderms are probably also used, though, in con-specific combat. So two Seregios kind of go at it, maybe for a mate, maybe for territory, like I said, but if we only see spiny Seregios and we don't see any without osteoderms that are more mobile, I think that's probably because they would be involved in mating in some way. and so that's going to put a bottleneck on the smooth-skinned Seregios. So this armor seems to have a pretty good reason to exist. Another thing that I thought was interesting and backs up this example, the armored parts of Seregios' body are all resistant to cutting damage more than blunt damage. And what that tells me is that they are adapted to withstand cutting forces. Now, what do Seregios' weapons all do? They do cutting damage. They cause you to bleed. And so Seregios' osteoderms are very well protective against other Seregios because just about every part of Seregios' body can cut you. So having that armor is pretty beneficial. So how do these scales actually work? My guess is that they're quite similar to porcupine quills, where they have kind of a fragile piece of tissue, which I have depicted here, and also up in here and in here. These are all attached to sort of fragile tissue that can pop and pull apart with force applied. Porcupines can't actually shoot their quills. That's a myth. They just come off really easily. There's almost like a spring method to it. So when you push down on a porcupine's quill, it causes the tissue to release. And so when that quill springs back out with elasticity, it can feel like it's shooting out of the porcupine, but that's not really what's happening. If that makes you feel any better, to all of my porcupine skewering victims out there. Seregios' quills also don't shoot out on their own. They're loosened and then they kind of shake them off the body. So it seems to be something quite similar. One thing you'll notice is that Seregios' quills can shoot up and come down on their own, like that, kind of like air brakes. And that's probably accomplished by having a muscle that pulls the front end down here. So this is the adductor muscle. This is going to pull it down. And then this is the depressor muscle. So when this is tightened, it'll pull this side down. So those are antagonistic muscle groups. When one of them is pulled, the other one will relax. And so when that depressor gets pulled, the spine will go like that. When the adductor is pulled, it'll go like that. But this is all just a hypothesis. This is my explanation of how this could work. Nothing about this is official. So yeah, here's my little diagram. You can see here, this is the bladed edge of the quill. This is a dorsal fin, so that when it flies off the body, it'll stay relatively stable. It has a pretty generally flight stable, structure to it. And then this is a tendon down here that holds the quill onto the body. When that snaps, it'll pop off. And here's an image of a porcupine quill. So this is the little piece of tissue on the bottom that will anchor it. And then this is also a bit of tissue that gets torn when the quill itself is loosened. So this gets pushed down, that tissue gets torn, and then it comes out very easily compared to typically if you would just grab a porcupine quill from the body and try pulling it out, it would be a lot harder as opposed to pushing down and then pulling out. It's kind of like a child-safe misted bottle. So another really interesting thing about Seregios is that it has this kind of club-like patch of osteoderms on its wing. This part right here is covered in spines and globs of scale, which I'm sure is quite heavy. And that's not flight efficient at all. You don't want that if you don't need it. But that addition of mass is going to make it a more effective and more stable flying surface. Now, you would think that just about everything that is flying long distances would absolutely never want that. However, there are a fair number of birds that do quite a bit of flying and have a structure similar to that. And there are ones who have much more toned down versions of it that still also do migration. Most, if not all, birds that are going to have weapons attached to their wings, like horned screamers and their friends, are going to be non-migratory because having a weapon attached to your flying apparatus is extraordinarily difficult. However, Canada geese fly very long distances. They're migrants, and they have just very thick, robust wing bones that they use in combat. So it's not necessarily the case that long distance flyers can never weaponize their wing bones. It's more so the case that the animals that do are ones that don't have as much of a pressure to fly long distances very consistently. There is a correlation there. It's time to talk about feet, which are my favorite part because I love foot biomechanics. I think they're so cool. And, among aviolans, which are the group that we're going to use as our analog here, aviolans are birds and their close relatives. They have so many different structures of foot arrangement. You can see here A, B, C, D, E are all the different kinds of aviolin feet. Just about every aviolin that is not a bird is going to have an anisodactyl or tridactyl foot pattern. So tridactyl is just going to be where those front three feet touch the ground, and this third one is not going to be there. Pretty much every monstro creature is either tridactyl, anisodactyl, or pamprodactyl. However, there's a few that are zygodactyl, like Seregios. So why? Well, before I spoil you on what zygodactyl feet are actually for, which is actually kind of boring, I want to tell you what they mean, which is the interesting part. So, in order for zygodactyl feet to evolve, Seregios has to take care of its young. And this is a total like Rube Goldberg example. But trust me when I say this is pretty airtight. So the development of feet is extraordinarily complex and it takes quite a bit of time. And if you don't have enough time from fertilization of the egg to having to move around as a baby, you can't really get all of that development and evolution done. If you look at the living birds, the anisodactyl foot shape is the one that is found in every single precocial bird. Now, when an animal is precocial, it means it's ready to go right out of the egg. A dinosaur, in many cases, from what we can tell, that's not a bird, can hatch and just start running around. Or at least do that with minimum effort. That's not to say that dinosaurs didn't take care of their young. You can still take care of your young if you're a precocial species, but it does indicate a different lifestyle. However, a lot of modern birds are altricial. So they come out, they're not really fully formed, they're kind of half-baked, and they need intense parental care for an extended period of time. Humans are altricial. If you left a baby on the road, it would die immediately. But precocial offspring can sometimes be separated from their parents. But altricial birds have incredibly diverse feet. So what does that mean? How does that freaking happen? What is the correlation between precocial animals and altricial animals, and how is that related to their feet? Well, if we go by T-Rex, we can know that um, the ancestor of all the flying wyverns presumably has that typical kind of three-toed arrangement. And so any modifications to that are going to need similar ones to the modifications to the foot structure in birds. So in order to develop those structures, you need actual time to develop in the nest. When animals are, being developed, they are soft. Their bones are not ossified. They're mostly cartilage. It takes a while for everything to mineralize, and when those bones are soft, if they're in the egg, muscle activity can occur in a programmed way and pull the digits of the feet into certain arrangements. So Seregios needs additional time with soft, non-ossified bones that it would not be able to have if it wasn't altricial, if it wasn't being cared for, where those feet are still developing and moving into their permanent shape. Those bones will eventually ossify. They'll turn into actual bone instead of cartilage. And then Seregios will be able to start walking and flying around with its fully formed zygodactyl feet. Now, this is so interesting and it's so bizarre that you can find out about what an animal's lifestyle and reproduction look like just by looking at its feet and the anatomy of its feet. But that's why science is so cool. So now you can feel free to imagine a cute baby Seregios being cared for by loving parents. Asterisk, there is also the possibility that Seregios is a brood parasite. That is, it lays its eggs in the nests of other species that have precocial young, or sorry, altricial young, and then it's cared for by them. That's how cuckoos work, and they have those four-toed zygodactyl feet. So asterisk, but I think it's probably safe to say that Seregios isn't a brood parasite. It just doesn't seem like the kind of animal that would be one, especially if they have that kind of intense mate selection type thing, but you never know. Sometimes people surprise you. Regardless, baby Seregios probably looks super cute, even if it's maybe half-baked. A lot of altricial babies come out without fully formed integumentary structures, so baby birds are born without feathers if they're altricial in many cases. So Seregios might come out without its scales, all smooth and slimy. Um, Seregios also definitely need to be fed by their parents for an extensive period of time, probably warmed too, because I imagine the osteoderms are probably acting as a little bit of an insulator and keeping heat near the body, so they need to be kept by their parents for a long time. Be an altricial species as well, and I have no idea how that arc-veiled egg survived. I have to imagine that someone came across it, thought it was cute, and then nursed the animal. Or maybe Nata snuck away and took care of it, but an altricial species that needs time to develop those structures, I don't know how they would have survived outside of the egg for long. Anyway, actually, I think it was that the arc veil probably cared for the baby. The guardian arc-veil did anyway, because it was hatched when they got to it. I forget. I have not seen that cutscene in a while. Anyway, why would you develop these? Seems like a very high cost. Anyway, zygodactyl feet are really good for gripping. If you look at Seregios' feet, they have gigantic recurved claws like this one. So this is a dromaeosaur claw. It's a Velociraptor mongoliensis. You see it has this nice curve here. When you have four of those, your foot is like an arcade claw machine. And rather than having just one gripping claw, having four that are pulling from every direction, it's going to be great for you. Fantastic experience if you're an active predator trying to hold down a struggling prey item. It just affords you a lot more control over the item you're manipulating, especially if you don't have hands like Seregios. You just have those wings. They're also great for gripping terrain, so branches, cliffs. If you're doing a lot of climbing, like a parrot, which parrots also have zygodactyl feet, it's pretty good idea to be able to do that. So I imagine that Seregios is probably using those feet to climb around high altitude areas and arid environments where it tends to live, so like those big mountains in the Windward Plains. Owls are an example of zygodactyl predators, and if you look at their feet, they're very similar to Seregios. You can see they have this basically the same arrangement. The Seregios foot is looked at from the top, but still, um, you have this kind of pair of almost parallel toes in the back here, and then these ones that are kind of at a right angle to each other. Seregios' feet look almost the exact same, and they have those big curved claws on the ends, which are fantastic for gripping and taking small prey, like Ceratinoth. So just some other fun anatomical details. If you look at Seregios' wings, not all those projections coming out of the back are fingers. One of them, probably the last one, is a like this weird wrist bone projection. This comes up frequently in nature. When animals develop wings, they often have weird wrist bones that stick out at weird angles to support a membrane. Pterosaurs have a bone in the wrist that sticks back towards the shoulder called the pteroid that supports a membrane in front of the wing. Yiki, which is a flying dinosaur, has this membrane back here. This part that's supporting it is not a finger, that's part of the wrist. And so Seregios seems to have something similar. I noticed this when I was counting the digits. It has two in the front of the wing, and then seemingly uh, like four digits behind the wing. But one of those is going to be a wrist projection. Other thing that's pretty interesting is the tail. It has a gigantic transversospinalis muscle, which is that one right there. And that means it's really, really good at curling the tail up above the animal's head, kind of like a scorpion. In general, Seregios doesn't have a ton of muscles dedicated to pulling the tail left and right, although the transversospinalis might be adapted to that somehow, because the neural spine is really tall. I still doubt it. So I think a lot of the side-to-side motion in Seregios' tail is just kind of it ragdolling as the hips swing around. And in terms of the muscles that could move the tail side to side, the ones that are there are pretty reduced, especially the caudofemoralis, which is a muscle that attaches to the tail and the legs. What that means is that Seregios is also using its legs to move from its hips rather than from its tail. So in a lot of reptiles, the tail muscles contract and they pull the legs backward. Seregios is not doing that, unlike many of the monster hunter monsters. Lagiacrus especially has gigantic caudofemoralis muscles. But Seregios are small, which is similar to owls, and so I imagine that was the case when they were looking at them. In general, this tail anatomy seems a lot more bird-like than it does monster-like. It might be needing to pull that tail up over its head to act as a brake, which is kind of funny. So what is Seregios' ecological niche? It doesn't necessarily have one in wilds. It's an animal that kind of bounces from ecosystem to ecosystem. it could be on the edge of extinction without really a traditional point where it can anchor and exist stably. But then again, a lot of species have gotten places for a while without a real stable position. Camels evolved in freezing cold North American climates, and now they're mostly found in the Middle East and Asia. Animals sometimes move in weird ways, go to weird places, and find new places to hang out. And sometimes that works out fine. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're generalists, it just means that they're adaptable enough to hang on. It doesn't seem to be particularly specialized to any niche in the plains. It's not really exploiting any specific species, and it doesn't have any adaptations that suggest that it's uniquely attuned to that environment. But it seems to be doing fine for itself. The environment that Seregios first evolved in is kind of a mystery, and I would love to go explore it and see what places produce these sorts of features specifically, what kind of other animals it's competing with, what the plant life is like, where it breeds, how it nests. It might just be passing through the windward plains, or it might be staying there for a while. Who knows? We'll have to figure out more when the next updates come out. At least the next updates that are not related to Final Fantasy. So yeah, thank you guys for tuning in. Appreciate it. And let me know if you have any questions. Go check, put in the comments. Let me know if you have any monsters you want me to cover or any topics in paleontology or biology you want me to chat about, because I'm happy to make little educational videos about those as well. More prehistoric planet videos or prehistoric kingdom videos, sorry, are coming, but I am busy and moving around right now, so this is what I banged out for the moment. Yeah, hope everybody's doing well, whatever they're doing, and I appreciate you coming by and staying to the end if you did. So, bye-bye.